Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I am here at the News Forum where all voices matter. It's time for our panel again, our monthly panel of experts and former politicos who know the scene from many different vantage points. With us today is the Honorable Joe Oliver, former Natural Resources Minister, former Finance Minister, and he's coming at us from Toronto. And then the Honorable Gary Marr is also with us. He is now the head of the Canada West Foundation, but was a former Alberta cabinet member as well as trade representative for Alberta in Washington, D.C. Welcome to you both, gentlemen.
Great to be with you.
Great to see you.
So, Joe, I'm going to go with you at first because it's kind of died down now, but we had this whole debate or controversy about whether we are in a recession or not. So can you answer the question for our viewers? Are we in a recession, and why or why not, depending upon your answer?
Well, this actually is a sensitive subject for me because I had to cope with the issue in 2015 prior to the election when the Liberals and the press, but I repeat myself, were talking about a technical recession, which is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Now, I argued at the time, not surprisingly, that we weren't, and there were, and I guess I mean, politicians don't always do this, but I'm going to try to be consistent. What we've got today is a minuscule negative number for the second consecutive quarter of I think 0.1%. And it depends. I mean, there's a number of ways of looking at what economic growth is, but let's take that one. So, I mean, technically, you might call it a recession, but on the other hand, employment's been up, and there's some other factors. I really don't think it's all that significant whether we're 0.1 above or below. What is significant is that the Canadian economy has been flat since 2015 in terms of growth of GDP per capita, which is individual prosperity. And that's a real serious problem. So you have to conclude that there's weakness in the economy, although there are a few bright spots. And we're falling behind the other OECD countries and falling behind, in particular, the United States. So while you can argue whether we're technically in a recession or not, the bigger picture is the economic situation is not good.
Thank you for
I
that.
think what's interesting about what Joe has to say is that technically, maybe there's a recession, maybe there's not, but if you ask the average Canadian, how are you feeling? That is a different question altogether. And I think it's
Right.
because of what Joe's talked about, the lack of productivity over the last 10 years makes Canadians feel like they're not getting ahead, makes it feel like there are recessionary sort of pressures on Canadians. Ask your average person, are you better off now than you were 2 years ago? I think the answer is probably going to be no, I'm not.
Yeah, Gary, well, let's go to the second question then. Though the job numbers for May were pretty positive, plus 87,000 jobs. So that seems to be good news.
Yeah, that is good news. I'm not sure what proportion of it was from the public sector, but certainly not all of it. And in the recent past, much of it has been in the public sector. So you can't hang your hat on one number on 1 month, but it's a sort of it shows you that when you look at economic numbers, it's always a series of contradictory facts, but you have to look at the overall. So what to the one of the questions, what part of that may be because fewer Canadians are looking for jobs.
Right.
I don't know whether we have a number on that, but that
Mhm.
so the discouragement factor can create an impression which doesn't really present the total picture.
Gary, we're going to get to you after this break. We'll be right back after these messages. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, having a conversation with the Honorable Joe Oliver, former Finance Minister, the Honorable Gary Marr, who is now head of the Canada West Foundation. Gary, we cut you off there, but what about Joe's point about the plus 87,000 jobs in the month of May for Canada? That seems to be a pretty good number.
Yeah, I think that's a good number, but as Joe says, there's a lot of layers to this onion in terms of trying to get to the core of it. We don't know exactly what sectors this is where these jobs have been created. Hopefully, more of them are from the private sector and not from the public sector. I know in British Columbia, for example, in the past 3 or 4 years, almost all the job growth has come from hiring. In the public sector, which doesn't create wealth. Private sector jobs help create wealth. Public sector jobs do not, and so it's a good trend if it is more private than it is public sector job growth.
Joe Oliver, I wanted to turn to the trade negotiations between Canada and the United States. Obviously, there's a July the 1st sort of starting gun when negotiations are supposed to start. There seem to be every day now positioning, jockeying between Canada and the U.S. What's your analysis of the situation? Anything to indicate where these talks are going?
This is really hard to know because the president, in addition to being unpredictable, is often contradictory. So I think his latest iteration or utterance was that maybe there shouldn't be a deal at all. Of course, that would require the United States to actually formally withdraw, because otherwise it renews itself, I guess, every 6 months or so. Anyway, they have 6 months to withdraw if they want. Otherwise, it sort of continues. That's not a satisfactory end result. But it could be, and we hope it is, simply posturing to soften up the other side in a negotiation. Janice Charette and Dominique Leblanc are the two negotiators for Canada, and they're trying to, if not create confidence, at least temper the fear and pessimism that's floating around by saying that progress is being made. But we can't we frankly can't really know. I think we just have to put forward the best deals possible, and I hope when we are doing so, we're we're confronting some of the domestic political issues, like with supply management, where we really don't have much of a leg to stand on with the Americans. It's a really huge irritant, and the policy, as I've mentioned many times, and others have as well, is fundamentally bad for Canada because it increases the price of dairy products and poultry, and that disproportionately hurts the least economically advantaged because they rely more on staples and others. It's a huge political problem, but it's something which we're going to have to probably deal with. So, I mean, I'm not really giving you an answer because I don't think anyone
No.
knows, including probably the negotiators themselves and maybe even the president.
Gary Marr, do you think that it's the tale doesn't really have a beginning, middle, or end right now, as Joe is suggesting?
No, well, I'd say this. I think Premier Moe really sums it up neatly when he says we should always take the president seriously, but we don't have to take him literally. And we've seen him say things in the past as part of a grander negotiating strategy on the part of the president. And this is, playbook, called the art of the deal. I think that there has been some progress made. There were some 36 trade irritants that were identified. by the parties as they're working together, Ms. Charette and Minister LeBlanc. Of those 36 trade irritants, 12 of them are said to be done. Then on top of that, we've got the whole issue of whether the Gordie Howe Bridge is going to open up or not. Again, that may be part of the president's strategy to try and get the best leverage that he can, knowing that that bridge is really important for trade between Canada and the United States. I think that I think that we're going to get a deal. I'm going to be on the optimistic side of this, and I think that the USTR, has indicated that
Right.
that they think that they can get a deal. I hear the same thing from
Right.
people like Ambassador Hoekstra. So.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with the Honorable Joe Oliver, the Honorable Gary Marr. Joe, I just wanted to talk about our trade relationship with China a little bit, and obviously Gary can chime in as well. But with Chinese electric vehicles making an appearance for the first time, it really opens up the discussion about advantages and disadvantages to deepening our trade relationship with the People's Republic of China. What do you see coming forward?
Well, I think we've got to be very clear-eyed about this. There are certainly advantages in having trade relationships with China, but we must be very careful and not contemplate a broader sort of free trade agreement. That to me would be unthinkable, and it would be obviously anathema from the American perspective. But that doesn't mean that it can't be commercially advantageous for Canada to sell its oil and gas to China. That's something that I tried to do way back, but couldn't deliver because we didn't have the pipelines to Tidewater. I think, if anything, that might even improve the asymmetrical nature between our two countries, because I mean they're not going to renege on a deal which would be advantageous to them, and if they did, we could sell the oil and gas elsewhere. Now, the EVs are a slightly different matter. It's something which has been opposed by the Automobile Association because they're concerned about the I guess about the supply chains. It's not a high percentage of the total amount of cars sold at all. I think it's about 3 or 4%, but it's a high percentage of the EV market. Maybe it's sort of 30% or so, the 49,000 cars in question. The United States has concerns about Chinese software coming into Canada and maybe into the United States. So, I mean, you can argue both sides of that issue. Clearly, Scott Moe is happy, but Doug Ford is not. These are issues which impact the country in different ways. But I think we should be very careful about the nature of our trade relationships and not see it as some kind of a panacea for moving away from the United States. That would have all sorts of deleterious implications, in particular the strategic relationship with the United States, but also it would go, frankly, to our sovereignty.
Gary Marr, do you share Joe Oliver's concerns?
I do agree with Joe on going into this very clear-eyed. The first tranche of vehicles that will come into Canada, the 49,000, there'll be names that are already familiar to Canadians, brand names like Tesla or Polestar or Volvo. The latter two being owned by Geely Autos out of China now. Teslas in the United States are manufactured in the United States. Teslas in Canada are manufactured in China. And I think that this will have perhaps some pressure on keeping the price and accessibility of EVs in Canada to a lower price. The focus in future years is going to be on EVs that cost less than $35,000.
Mm.
I don't think that there is any American EV that can match that price. Maybe the Chevy Volt is the closest one. I accept the argument that the auto sector is concerned about wanting to be aligned with the United States, but on the other hand, the United States has indicated that we're going to take all the manufacturing and we're going to repatriate it to the United States. Now, will there still be a role for the auto parts sector? That's a different question, perhaps, and one that can thrive in Ontario by providing materials for manufacturing that's ultimately completed in the US. And so there are pros and cons. And as Joe said, the ability to move commodities to China, be they oil and gas or canola or wheat, are all important for other parts of the country. And I do have understanding and appreciation for what this will mean for the auto sector, because you won't be able to manufacture automobiles in Canada unless you've got access to the US market. And if they're going to be stopped, then you've got a problem.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with my special monthly guests, the Honorable Joe Oliver and the Honorable Gary Marr. Gary, I'm going to throw this question to you. You're obviously in Calgary, and there's been a lot of talk recently from the Premier of Alberta and others, I think Prime Minister Carney as well, talking about the economic impact of Alberta not only separating, but even having the debate leading up to the October referendum. How do you see the economic impact with this referendum looming in the future?
Well, let me go back to what the referendum question is, first of all, which will happen in October of this fall. There was a court decision that took off a clear question about whether Albertans wish to separate or not, and that the court had determined that there had been insufficient consultation with First Nations, of which there are some 47 of them here in Alberta, all of whom are opposed to separation. And so that clear question about whether you want in or out of Canada has now been taken off the agenda. Instead, the Premier has put forward a question that is, to put it simply, a referendum on a referendum. So the question that will be faced and put before Alberta voters this fall, this October, will be, should we have a referendum on the question of remaining in Canada? So it's a referendum on a referendum. As that moves forward, there are expressions of concern with even on the murkier question about a referendum on a referendum, about where this leads to in terms of sovereign certainty, about First Nations, about the subdivisibility of Alberta into more than just being separate from Canada, but could the cities separate from such an Alberta? What would happen to the First Nations,
Sure.
the 47 First Nations? Could they sever themselves from the rest of Alberta? And then you've got individuals like Mitch Sylvester, who said publicly, the only people that will be citizens of an independent Alberta will be those that are born in Alberta. The result is that the more the separatists state their case, I think that there has been a diminished interest on the part of Albertans to vote in favor
Interesting.
of having a referendum. The latest polls that I saw released earlier this week is that sentiment is down about 10% from where it was a month ago.
Interesting. Joe, what's your perspective on all this?
Well, as an Ontarian who has spent some time in Alberta, I think they've got some legitimate concerns that need to be addressed. They've been treated as as an exploited cash cow for for decades. They're contributing significant amounts via transfer payments to other provinces, in particular Quebec, indirectly, and they haven't been treated as well as they would like, in particular in respect to the development of their natural resources. So here they are, providing money to the rest of Canada, and they're being thwarted in doing more. And that combined with like a sort of a dismissive attitude, let's face it, in Eastern Canada about Westerners, which is uncalled for and certainly not appreciated. Having said that, I certainly would be very unhappy if they voted for separation, and it certainly doesn't look like they will. But the concern is that a big number, and people are in a referendum. On a referendum, they can express their irritation without worry about any real consequences. But there would be consequences, let's say, to a 30% vote in favor of it, and the premier is treading a very fine line in that regard. And then, of course, we have Quebec watching
Right.
like a hawk to see what happens. So this is a difficult time, and I have to say that unless the oil pipeline ideas go through, this
Could be trouble. Yeah.
not going to go away. And then there's the Supreme Court case
Sure.
regarding the notwithstanding clause. So there are some risks ahead of us.
I guarantee you this is not the only time we'll be discussing this topic, but we are out of time today. Gentlemen, the Honorable Joe Oliver, the Honorable Gary Marr, thanks for joining me today.